The idea of using disease as a weapon gained a new level of sophistication in the early 1930s as nationally funded research programs on biological warfare were developed. The Japanese had a very active offensive biowarfare research program, which included a battalion known as Unit 731. In their program, the Japanese conducted experiments on humans using 15 to 20 different disease-causing agents, with anthrax being one of their.
As we are all aware, World War II was not pretty. A lot of horrible shit happened. The Second World War was the birthplace of numerous ungodly horrors that would break even the sturdiest of minds. Soldiers watching their brethren dying on the battleground in front of their own eyes, going back home with a broken mind, shattered by the conflict and the pain witnessed. Nazi experimentations, the persecution of Jewish people. Concentration camps designed to break the spirits of those same Jewish people, use every single piece of their might and energy, and when that all had been sapped away for the use of the Nazis, those Jewish people were forced into showers, forced to strip down into nothing, while they were poisoned by the horrific Zyklon B. This is just the beginning. What I am about to explain to you will truly open your eyes to some of the evil during that time period. This is the story of Unit 731, the story that they don't want you to hear. Let's start at the root of the problem. I'm talking about Unit 731, a covert biological and chemical warfare research and development unit. Formed by the Japanese Imperial Army in 1947 on the brink of the war, and ceased operations in 1945 at the very climax. It started as a mere agency to promote public health, and was originally intended to research the human body, to better aid the Japanese soldiers in keeping fighting fit. Early experiments had volunteers signing consent waivers, trying to find out how long the body could withstand hunger or a lack of water, but as the war intensified, they soon changed their methodology. Spearheaded by Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, the unit began to take an interest in warfare involving biological and chemical weapons, even though it had been outlawed as a war crime by the 1925 Geneva Accords. Nevertheless, they pushed onwards, believing preparing for these types of warfare to be the best strategy, in fear that other nations would beat them to the punch and use these methods on them first. Of course, they never would get willing volunteers to have nasty chemicals tested on them, so the unit instead resorted to using prisoners of war that they had captured over the course of the conflict, some Korean, some Chinese, none of them willing. They essentially turned them into human disease incubators. Despite the unit's innocent beginnings, they quickly became an assembly line for weaponized diseases that could have destroyed the world multiple times over if they were ever unleashed. The experiments performed to reach this position were inhumane, cruel, and the very nature of evil cannot be summarized by any number of words in the English or any language. One of the earliest experiments carried out by Unit 731 was that of frostbite testing. One of the physiologists assigned to the unit, Yoshimura Hisato, had a disturbing special interest in hypothermia and its effect on the human body, and, more specifically, limbs. As a part of his studies, Hisato would routinely submerge the limbs of POWs in tubs of water that were filled with ice. Hisato would hold them down, giving no reprieve until the submerged limb was frozen solid with a coat of ice formed around the skin. Hisato then tried different methods in order to thaw and reheat these limbs as efficiently as possible. He sometimes did this by dousing the affected limb with scalding hot water. Sometimes he would hold the frozen limb close to an open fire, or sometimes he simply just left the limb overnight to see how quickly the subject's blood could thaw the ice. Another experiment conducted by Unit 731 was the vivisection of conscious POWs. One element of this unit, named Maruta, took the idea of being a medical research unit beyond the bounds of medical ethics and decided to observe and test the effects of injury and disease on live patients. The main subjects used for these tests were Chinese POWs, which Unit 731 decided to use to their advantage. Unit 731 began to perform vivisections on these subjects, which involved mutilating the bodies of the prisoners with no anesthetic in order to study the operations of the body and the reaction of the POW. Thousands of men and women, including the elderly and children, were infected with hideous diseases such as cholera and the bubonic plague, and then had their organs removed for examination while they were still alive. Other test subjects had their limbs removed and then reattached to different parts of their body. Some had their limbs frozen, crushed, or had their circulation cut off. At the end of all this, when the body of the POW was used up and was no longer of any use to them, the prisoner would either be shot to death or given the lethal injection. Scarily enough though, there is speculation that some POWs were not even worth that much effort and were simply just buried alive by Unit 731. A witness in a lawsuit against the Japanese government carried out by 180 Chinese survivors and families of survivors. Yoshio Shinozuka, a member of Unit 731 whose job was to scrub patients before vivisection, provided a testimony that exposed the tests carried out in excruciating detail. I still remember clearly the first live autopsy I participated in. My legs were shaking so badly, I could hardly stand up. I knew the Chinese individual was dissected alive because I had taken his blood once before for testing. At the vivisection, I could not meet his eyes because of the hate he had in his glare at me. The victim had been infected with the plague and was totally black. Shinozuka was reluctant to use the brush on the man's face. Watching me, the chief pathologist, with scalpel in hand, impatiently signaled me to hurry up. I closed my eyes and forced myself to scrub the man's face with the deck brush. The chief pathologist listened to the man's heartbeat with his stethoscope, and then the procedure started. We called the victims logs, he said. We did not want to think of them as people. We did not want to admit that we were taking lives. So we convinced ourselves that what we were doing was like cutting down a tree. When you see someone in that state, you just can't move. Your mind goes blank. The fear is overwhelming, said Yoshio. Another interest of the Japanese army was the effectiveness of their weapons against their enemies. How did they decide to determine this? They would round up captives on a firing range and then shot at the POWs with various weapons and proceeded to compare wound patterns and penetration depths as the inmates lay dying around them. Things like bayonets and swords were tested in much the same way, except the victim was usually bound. Flamethrowers were tested on both covered and exposed skin. Subjects were exposed to nerve gas and blister agents. Heavy objects were dropped onto the bodies of bound victims in order to study the injuries. Unit 731 tested every vile thing you could think of, but they carried out viler still. One of the most horrific acts committed by Unit 731 were the experiments involving assault and forced pregnancy, which soon became a common feature of their experiments. Female POWs who were at the age to bear a child were forcibly impregnated, so that weapon and trauma experiments could be performed upon them. They were subjected to various diseases, shot in non-fatal areas, and exposed to chemical weapons. At the very end of these tests, the pregnant women would be opened up, whether alive or dead, so that the fetuses could be studied. Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night, the culmination of all of Unit 731's planning and research. For them, this was the big one. Operation PX, or Cherry Blossoms at Night, was an attack planned by the Japanese military on the civilians of the United States, using the weaponized bubonic plague developed by Unit 731, which they had planned to deliver using seaplanes. This operation was proposed in December of 1944 by Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa of the Japanese Naval General Staff. The PX name came from the code name used for the plague-infested fleas. The Navy decided to partner with Shiro Ishii and began to plan the attack, which revolved around the use of Seiren aircraft, floatplanes, which would be launched by submarine aircraft carriers. The targets of these attacks were planned to be the west coast of the US, or more specifically, the cities of San Francisco, San Diego, and Los Angeles. The planes were planning to spread the weaponized bubonic plague along with the previously tested cholera and typhus. It was planned for the submarine crews to actually infect themselves first with these diseases and pathogens, and then afterwards they would run ashore in order to infect the populations in a suicide mission. Now, why did this operation not come to fruition? Surely, Unit 731 wanted to put to use all that they had learned in a final trump card against the US. The operation was finalized in March of 1945, but was shelved only due to the opposition of Yoshijiro Umezu. Umezu did not want to take that final leap that would change the face of war irrevocably. Umezu went on to say that, if bacteriological warfare is conducted, it will grow from the dimension of war between Japan and America to an endless battle of humanity against bacteria. Japan will earn the derision of the world. Just after the surrender of Japan, on the 2nd of September, 1945, Shiro Ishii planned one last hurrah in order to battle the US. His plan was to stage a suicide germ attack against the US troops that were currently occupying Japan. Thankfully, Umezu once again stepped in and asked for Ishii to instead wait for another opportunity, as he did not want Ishii to die in a suicide attack. After the end of the war in 1977, former Captain Ino Yoshio, who was involved in the planning of the attack, gave an interview on the operation. He went on to say, "This is the first time I have said anything about Operation PX, because it involved the rules of war and international law. The plan was not put into actual operation, but I felt that just the fact that it was formulated would cause international misunderstanding. I never even leaked anything to the staff of the War History Archives at the Japanese Defense Agency, and I don't feel comfortable talking about it even now. But at the time, Japan was losing badly, and any means to win would have been alright." Of course, at the end of World War II, we know that the Nazis were defeated and captured by the Allies. The Allies sought swift and fair justice and put the representatives of the defeated Nazi Germany on trial in Nuremberg from 1945 to 1946 for plotting and carrying out the invasions of countries such as Poland and France, and for committing countless horrific war crimes. Many of those that were put on trial attempted the defense of superior orders, now known as the Nuremberg Defense, claiming that they could not be convicted of the crimes that they had been accused of because they were only following the orders of their superiors. Defendants further claimed that refusal of an order likely would have resulted in their own death, and so they had no choice. The London Charter of the International Military Tribunal decided that this defense was no longer sufficient to escape punishment, and that it was no longer a defense for war crimes, but could be used as a mitigating factor in order to lessen a penalty. In the end, this defense proved to be a failure, and of the 177 defendants on trial, 24 were sentenced to death, and a further 98 were given prison sentences. So, when the Axis powers were overcome, what punishment befell those of Unit 731 at the climax of the war? What crimes were they deemed to have committed, and what punishment was delivered unto them in retribution for the atrocities that they had committed? Overseen by General Douglas MacArthur, the American government decided that as part of their surrender, the Japanese government were forced to hand over all documentation and data relating to biological warfare and human experimentation, namely that conducted by Unit 731 throughout the years. In return for this, the US government agreed to grant political immunity to all of those who engaged in human experimentation and other crimes against humanity. MacArthur also saw the pardoning of the commander of that unit, Shiro Ishii, and General Masashi Kitano. The reason for this complete and utter subversion of justice? The explicit reason for the United States pardon of Unit 731 members was entirely strategic. The threat posed by the USSR. Unit 731's experiments, horrific as they were, provided enormous amounts of useful medical knowledge and data to the United States Army regarding biological and chemical warfare. It was decided by MacArthur that this information would be invaluable in a future war against the Soviet Union, and deemed its secrecy a strategic priority, and so all data gathered relating to the unit became strictly confidential. The US Army's response to public inquiry regarding Japanese experimentation on human subjects was a mix of feigned ignorance, outright deception, and intentional suppression. When prodded by American journalists, US Army leadership repeatedly claimed to have found no evidence of Japanese experimentation on human test subjects. In an ironic twist of fate, it was the USSR themselves who were the ones to shed light on MacArthur's deceptions when they captured multiple facilities used by 731 for research in Manchuria, and after concluding that the Imperial Japanese Army had been performing biological experiments on Allied POWs, they set up a human rights tribunal in the city of Khabarovsk. Unfortunately, the trial did not bring 731 members to justice, but at the time, this was the only public recognition and source of the atrocities committed. As to be expected, the trial was publicly dismissed by US officials as communist propaganda. So there you have it. No punishment befell these monsters whatsoever. Shiro Ishii died as a free man in 1959, even though his testimony detailing experiments and duties concerning the experiments was used in another tribunal. To this day, none of those involved with the experiments have been punished in any form, and many have re-entered society and had successful careers. What makes the pardoning even more egregious is the fact that numerous sources indicate that it is very likely that American POWs themselves were used in the experiments. What kind of precedent do you set with your own people when one of the US's most trusted institutions becomes complicit in a cover-up of an atrocity of that magnitude? What of the members of Unit 731? What do they have to say for themselves regarding their experimentation and war crimes? When giving his statement, Yoshio Shinazuka declared his remorse. He said that he was reluctant to participate in the experiments at all, that he experienced overwhelming fear seeing the victims in that state. While this does not excuse his actions or participation, his remorse was more than what was offered by former Unit 731 member Toshimi Mizobuchi. Mizobuchi had no modicum of remorse for his crimes, stating that he saw the victims merely as logs. They were logs to me. Logs were not considered to be human. They were either spies or conspirators. As such, he said, they were already dead, so now they die a second time. We just executed a death sentence. After World War II, Mizobuchi went on to become a real estate agent, and even told us that a reunion for the veterans of Unit 731 was held almost every year, and that he himself was responsible for the organization of at least one of them. What kind of sick monster holds an annual celebration of war crimes and the cruel murder and experimentation on countless innocents? One unnamed soldier, who was part of the unit and confessed to torturing a man, stated that after he had finished, "I felt nothing. We did not think of them as people, but as objects." In August 2002, after 27 court hearings in total since 1997, 3 judges of the Tokyo District Court rejected a claim for an apology and denied compensation, claiming that the Chinese survivors were not legally entitled to compensation from the Japanese government due to an expiration of the statute of limitations. The Tokyo Higher Court dismissed the suit again in 2005 and rejected a demand for an apology once more in 2007. Even today, research on this unit continues to be conducted, and more facts are being unearthed. As recently as 2018, the Japanese government provided a list with more than 3,600 members of Unit 731 to a Japanese scholar. Yet even with more information, the history of this heinous unit is still hidden, largely in the shadows, to those not actively seeking the information. Since World War II, the efforts of Germany to reconcile, to educate, and to ensure that history does not repeat itself is immeasurable. In contrast, Japan did not even acknowledge what Unit 731 had done until 1988, 44 whole years later. And to this day, the government has never issued any sort of official apology for the atrocity. And 78 years after the crimes, it seems unlikely that they ever will. I want to thank you all for taking the time to watch this video. It took a long time to create all of this and been in the works for a long time, and your support is incredibly appreciated. For those of you who came over from my main channel Tetsuya, I thank you. For those of you who found me through this, I thank you as well. I really hope you enjoyed. Any feedback from me is more than welcome, especially regarding bits of information I may have left out. There was a lot more I wanted to cover, but it seemed like an overload of information, and I didn't want to get bogged down in the heinous experiments they did, because there's so many more that if you have the time, go and look them up. It's really important that we learn these parts of history. I didn't want to overload with gore and things like that. I wanted to focus on the overall message of the video, which is bringing attention, which I feel like I have. Shout out to T6 or Maverick Files for giving me a fuck ton of tutorials for After Effects so that my videos don't look boring as fuck. But yeah, I thank you. Anyways, this has been Mericlea, and I will see you next time.